All right. Good to have all of you, Village Church. Good to be back with you. Hopefully you guys have been doing well. Here at the Masterclass, the last couple of weeks, you've had Ken did a great job, and then the site pastors, the lead pastors across all the sites, Chris and Vin and Jordan and Michael Chinchilla. It was awesome to have them teaching our church, and so I'm glad to be back. Hopefully you're glad to have me back. I actually went away with my family. I spoke at a conference, an apologetics conference, a couple of weeks ago in Sacramento, and then we stayed on, and then I spoke at Bayside Church down there, and then spoke at a conference called Sticky Teams in San Diego, and so our friends have a spot there, and so we got to stay there for a week or so, and it's just a great time, get away with family, but always good to come back, and I'll share with you kind of something that happened that kind of taught me some things about family. But right now, 1 Corinthians chapter 1 is where we're going to go. We're in Masterclass. This is week 7 of Masterclass, and what we're going to hit today is a whole bunch of things, but I really want to make kind of maybe 2 or 3 major movements and talk about 2 or 3 major topics that come out through the text. So 1 Corinthians chapter 1, we've hit a bunch of stuff. Pastor Ken hit some verses all the way down to verse 14 or 15, so I'm going to try to get us down to verse 17. So if we start at verse 14, Paul says, "I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, so that no one may say that you were baptized in my name." And he's kind of talking about, hey, stop elevating me as a pastor or a leader. Stop kind of creating tribes and leaders that you pay attention to versus other leaders. He says, verse 16, "I did baptize also the household of Stephanus. Beyond that, I do not know whether I baptized anyone else." I like that because the Apostle Paul can't remember all your names either. So it gives me encouragement. So the reality, he's like, I baptized some people I don't even know anymore who I baptized or whatever. And his point is they were elevating, like, who baptized me? Who's your leader? Who I follow this guy, I follow Apollos, I follow this guy. And Paul's going, man, we got to get some things straight. So the first thing he hits is baptism. And of course, baptism is this thing that the New Testament sets up as the thing that we're supposed to go out and do to the world as the symbol that somebody has become a believer, has given their life to Jesus. Comes from the Old Testament, the idea of kind of a new exodus. You come through the waters, you leave the slavery of your old life, and you come through the waters, not of the Red Sea like Israel did, but the waters of baptism, and you come out into freedom. And a lot of you you haven't taken that step yet. And you got to understand that there was no such thing in the New Testament as a unbaptized Christian. In the first century, that was what it meant to be. It was like, okay, I've given my life to Jesus. This is what I do. I publicly profess my faith in Jesus by getting baptized, by going under the water, coming out clean. And over the last 8 years, we've seen 1,400 people get baptized at Village Church, which is crazy. It's amazing. Yeah, praise God for that. It's incredible. I know a lot of pastors that go their whole ministry and they won't even see any part of that. And so that's a movement of God. It's something that the New Testament lays on us, just even at Church in the Park this past summer. I got to baptize my oldest daughter, Sienna, and she's 12. And we've always seen it as something we want to make sure our kids actually know what they're doing. And so baptism for us as a church, it's not something we do with infants, because we want people to actually know, hey, I've believed in Jesus, and now this is what I'm doing with my life. And so that's why we wait until people know what they're doing. They can profess faith in Jesus. They understand doctrinally what they're doing. They understand what Jesus has done for them and what the symbol means. It's not just like sometimes we'll go down and do baptisms, and then my kids will go home and they'll like jump in the bathtub and they'll start playing baptism. And it's like, this doesn't count, kids. This is evil. And so what you got to understand is it actually means something when the church gets together and we do. So that's really what he's talking about. And some of you haven't done that line in the sand yet. You haven't been baptized. You haven't said, partly because you're afraid. All right, there's cowardice in your hearts and minds because you're actually like Israel, who went through the waters of the Red Sea and then got out, and then they got some struggles, and they said, bring us back, Moses. We want to go back to Egypt where at least we got food. And some of you are like, you're afraid to get baptized because you're like, I want to go back to comfort. I want to go back to what I know. I want to go back to the things, and you're afraid of what it actually might mean for you. But our challenge to you over and over again, as Paul founded this church in Corinth, was these people would believe they'd come out of these messed up lifestyles. They were sexually perverse, as we're going to see in chapter 4 or 5. There was so much sexual perversion, so much greed, so much disaster in their culture that they were a part of. Then they became Christians and came out of it, and they were kind of afraid, because if you publicly get baptized, it's very interesting. In the Western world, baptism is such a safe thing, but you travel around the world, you go to China, you go to the Middle East, baptism, you could get killed for that. Right? That's the reality. You go public with your faith in Jesus and get baptized. Forget, 500 people standing on a pier watching you get baptized in the ocean. You got to kind of go away with 2 or 3 and do it secretly, because symbols are extremely powerful things. And people say, baptism's only a symbol. No, baptism is a symbol. A symbol is extremely powerful. With everything about our life, if we walk, these are just symbols. Symbols are extremely powerful things. If I, walked around and someone said, "Are you married?" Don't worry about it. It's just a ring. It's just a symbol. What are you doing later? That's not how it works. You got to understand symbols are massively powerful, and that's why Jesus gave them to us. And then you have this phrase that I want to spend most of the rest of our time on. It says, "I did baptize also the household of Stephanas." And here's what we got to understand. We got to stop and hit that. The whole household. Think about that for a second. And what I want to talk about is our dream for your life, and your dream for your life is that your whole household should actually come to believe and follow Jesus. That's the reality. Not just, here's what we've got ourselves into in Western individualistic democratic society is we think, my life is about my personal relationship with Jesus, and once I've got that squared away, I've got everything figured out. But the New Testament has this concern, and what Paul says is, I actually came and I baptized the household of Stephanas. I actually, his kids, his wife, his grandparents, his family. And what you've got to start to understand is your responsibility in this life is your whole household, not just you. And so when we begin to understand, how do you actually, we all want our families to love and follow Jesus. We're living in a crazy time where right now, when it comes, and if you don't have kids here, you may have kids when you get married and go on, or you might have grandkids now and your kids are raised. For the next few minutes, this is relevant to you because the question is, how do you have a household? How do you actually raise kids that love and follow Jesus? And the reality is we're living in a time right now when in regard to identity and education and politics and faith and media and education, entertainment, it seems like everyone around us is actually is out to try to counter disciple the kids that we're trying to tell about Jesus, the families that we're trying to raise. That we're actually, everything around us we're called to disciple people, and every media outlet, everything that we listen to, every show we watch, everything seems to be kind of geared on, let me actually counter disciple your kids. Let me redefine everything for them. Let me redefine what they do with their bodies. Let me redefine what they do with their money. Let me redefine what success looks like. Let me redefine education. Let me redefine formation. All of it is actually built so that our job, and which is actually true in the Bible, actually Ephesians 2 talks about the fact that there's the prince of the power of the air. That's what it calls the devil, actually. Prince of the power of the air, Ephesians 2, which means most of these spheres of society are inundated with a counter-disciple, counter-Jesus message, and it's trying to constantly form us into the image of the empires that we live in. Because the reality is goodness and love and kindness is amazing, but it's actually less interesting than the things of the world that actually kind of gear to our passions, our desires. If I think about what's more interesting to watch, a movie about Batman or a movie about the Joker? I'm thinking about, we love villains, right? Because not doing things the way that Jesus asks us to is far more interesting at times to watch and to look at and to live out than it feels like to, be kind and be nice. These things aren't invigorating to the soul. I was driving in my car yesterday and my 10-year-old was talking to my 7-year-old about a fight that the 7-year-old and her friend had. And she's like, my 7-year-old Bella, she's like, well, she talked down to me. And she's like, yeah, but you're supposed to, when she says something mean to you, you're supposed to say something nice to her. And she's like, yeah, but she made me feel bad. And if I said something nice to her, that wouldn't make her feel bad the way I felt bad. That would just do nothing. And so I wanted to make her feel how I felt. And so when she looked at me and she said, yeah, you know why your mom doesn't, then I said this, yeah, well, your mom doesn't even like you. And she's like, it made me feel good. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And my kids, because the reality was, it's like to do things the way Jesus is sometimes less interesting because how many of us would have watched Braveheart if it was like, oh my goodness, the English came in, raped his wife, killed her, and Braveheart's response was he prayed for his enemy, right? And 2 hours of prayer. We'd be like, loser. We want Braveheart to put the paint on. We can ride in the horse and take the thing and smush the guy's face and cut his head off and rip his arms. That's what we want. And so the reality is we're constantly in the mode of how do I be a kingdom person in the world that I'm in? How do we actually counter disciple our kids' minds, hearts in the ways of the kingdom? And the reality is we have to show our kids that the world's not all bad. We tend to focus on it. We tend to, hey, the kids are, the world has beautiful things in it. I was driving the whole family and my wife. We had been to SeaWorld like 2-3 days ago. And my wife watched the dolphin show and just started, she left. I'm like, so how's the show? She's like, it's the dolphins. And she's crying at dolphins at SeaWorld. I'm like, what is your deal? Right? They're throwing the fish and they're like, whack, whack. She's like, it's just so beautiful. Right? My wife has like a thing in her soul when things do things in unison, like when they're all together and they all move together or whatever, she's just like, oh my goodness, look, they would have got together, they would have practiced it, my gosh, the world is beautiful. Like what? Like she can do that when she watches like the Thriller dance though, right? Like Michael Jackson going, and it's like, oh my goodness, look at zombies, they're so beautiful. The reality is there's these beautiful things in the world. And what we have to be careful of is to go too negative where we think, okay, the prince of the power of the air, we've destroyed education, we've destroyed media, we've destroyed. The reality is there's such beauty in the world that we need to stop. And we need, my dedication line for my book, The Problem of God, is to my kids. And it talks about the fact that I hope that as they grow up, they actually learn to follow Jesus in both the beauty and the teeth of the world. And I think that we do ourselves a disservice with our kids if we just constantly live in a state of fear and we don't go, open your eyes, kids. Dolphins, there's beauty. There's things that God is doing among us. The world is not our enemy in that sense. We're supposed to understand that we are in the world but not of the world, but we're to recognize this is God's good creation. And there's this reality as we start to think through how do we actually disciple our kids. So let me give you 6 points on how I think we need to disciple our kids and disciple our households. Deuteronomy 11 says this, you shall teach them to your children, talking about the things of God, the ways of God, talking of them when you're sitting in your house and when you're walking by the way, when you lie down and when you rise. So that's Deuteronomy's kind of version for you as parents, or grandparents or people who are gonna have kids, whatever. It's saying, how are you gonna actually have a household that loves and follows Jesus? You shall teach them to your children, talking of them when you're sitting in your house, when you're walking by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. So here's the 6 things I think we gotta do. First, you gotta teach them. You actually have to teach your kids doctrine, teach them about Jesus. Don't let your kids just derive theology from absolutely nothing. You have to teach them how to pray. You have to teach them who God is. You have to teach them what salvation is. You don't wanna just go, well, I hope the youth group teaches them. Let's make sure we drop them off there and move on. Deuteronomy says it's your job. When you're sitting and eating, when you're walking along the beach. Now, I'm not talking about being like that dad, all right? Where it's like literally we were on the beach in San Diego for a couple hours this past week, and my kids brought me Chick-fil-A, all right? They had run out and got it, and they ran it down to me at the beach, and they handed it to me. It's not like at that moment I'm like, okay, hold on, everyone. Let's stop. Remember, Jesus ate on the beach in John 21. They'd be like, Dad, let us go. Here, Chick-fil-A, bam, all right? Don't be that guy. The reality is, but you got to teach your kids, you got to teach them doctrine, you got to teach them who God is, you got to help them understand. Here's how salvation is. This is how salvation works. This is who Jesus is. This is who you are. And so we got to understand, and if we don't do that, then here's what happens. Culturally, there was a guy named Christian Smith, who's a sociologist years ago, did a study on what most people in the Western world's version of God is, even people who believe in God. And he came up with a phrase that as he did his data, he realized most people's view of God is what he called moralistic therapeutic deism, which is basically most people out there believe that if you're a good person and it's good for yourself, then God is distant. So if you're a good person, God will save you. Therapeutic, meaning it's good for you, it makes you feel good. So if something makes you feel good and it's moralistically okay, then you need to do those things, believe those things. And deistic, meaning God is very far away, all right? He's the Bette Midler version of God. He's very far. He's not involved in creation, not involved in our life at all. And that's what most people out on the street, even who say they believe in God, even people in our churches, the way that you're raising your kids tends to be that at the end of the day, if you were to sit down and say, hey, what do you actually believe about God? They're moralistic, therapeutic deists. And the reality is you have to fight that every day by actually teaching them proper ideas of who God is. You got to work against their own inclinations as kids. Because their own inclinations, you know this, that you cannot be a slave to your own desires, right? I was talking about this down at, when I was at Bayside, the idea that why weddings are sometimes difficult for me, because I get together with these kids who've known each other for 18 months, and the idea that, hey, they've all, and they're up there and they're like, we love each other. And we're like, really? That's blowing all our minds right now, that you two love each other. We've all put on our nice suits. We've come here. We bought you a nice wedding gift, and you're blowing our minds by saying you love each other. And they're like, hey, Pastor, can I do my own vows? I'm like, oh my gosh, here we go. All right. And so they get up and they do their vows. Tracy, I wrote you a poem. T, trustworthy. R, irresponsible. All right, and you're just like, oh my gosh, what is going on right now? All right, this is brutal. And the reality is you just want to fast forward the clock 12 years after all their struggles and all their tensions and all their kids, and then watch them go out and get the nice look from the ladies, and how you feel inside is now she's making you feel how your wife didn't make you feel. Be very careful to follow how you feel. It can derail your life. And the reality is we have to shape our kids' inclinations tend to be away from what they actually want. We got to teach them to desire the things that Jesus desires for their life, not change what they do. That's moralistic. Change what they want to do. Change the things they take pleasure in. So you're teaching them how to pray. You got to teach kids how to actually pray. This is what it means to have a household. They're gonna watch you, and I remember I was discipling a guy, and I was like trying to teach him how to pray. Have you ever listened to your kids' prayers? Think through their theology. Sometimes they're bad. This 20-year-old kid I was discipling, we were praying in this car, and I'm like, Father, that, and he's like, yeah, Lord, thanks for making Satan your beep, and he swore. I'm like, oh, okay, we got to rein that in a little bit. I'm like, all right, so because you got to teach your kids how to pray. If I listen to your kids pray, do they even understand what they're doing, what they're saying, who they're praying to? You got to study the Bible with your kids, right? Don't assume that your kids are going to actually understand the Bible. And I understand the tension. They tend to read it and they're sometimes bored. I have Jesus storybook Bibles. I sit with my kids. I'm like, okay, here's Jesus. They're like, oh man, Jesus is boring. I want John the Baptist again. All right, he's weird. And I'm like, Jesus is boring. This is a problem for a pastor's kid. Why? Oh, he's just so good. He's always helping everybody. I want the bad guys, right? And I'm like, so you got to teach your kids to love the hero, right? And understand why they got to love the hero. I understand you're scared because you sit down with your kids, you start teaching the Bible, and they say weird things and you don't necessarily know what to do. All right, you got to teach them how to pray. You got to teach them to go after affections that are the affections of God, not the affections of themselves. You got to teach them how to study the Bible. You have to ask them about the questions that they have, all right? At any age and stage. William Lane Craig said this years ago as he watched kids go to high school and go to college and lose their faith. He said this, in high school and college, Christian teenagers are intellectually assaulted with every manner of non-Christian worldview, coupled with an overwhelming relativism. If parents are not intellectually engaged with their faith and do not have sound arguments for Christian theism and good answers to their children's questions, then we are in real danger of losing our youth. It's no longer enough to teach our children simple Bible stories. They need doctrine and apologetics, which is defense of the faith. It's hard to understand how people today can risk parenthood without having studied a defense of the faith. Unfortunately, our churches have also largely dropped the ball in this area. It's insufficient for youth groups and Sunday school classes to focus on entertainment and simpering devotional thoughts. We've got to train our kids for war. We dare not send them out to the public school and university armed with rubber swords and plastic armor. The time for playing games is past. And I believe that. That's why right from youth all the way up to what we do here week in and week out, we're constantly preaching and teaching you not just what to think, but how to think. I don't want to feed you the answers, man. I want you to become good arguers and defenders of the faith. I want you to understand that Christianity is the best idea in the marketplace of ideas. How to think rationally and philosophically about why do you think I do that every week? It's not to entertain myself. I wrote a book on it. I know it all. I do it for you so you can learn how to think and then teach your kids how to think. And be like, kid, there's actually rational understanding to this. Go to school and let them give you this. Fine, do that. Listen, the reality is you got to teach your kids, and we want to do that. We focus on that. From youth all the way up to here, every single week, we're constantly, whenever the text allows us to talk about how Christianity is actually philosophically, historically, literarily, the best idea in the marketplace of ideas. That's what we want, and that's what we train you and your kids to do, and you got to do that. Okay, secondly, actually make your faith part of your life. Right, when we were leaving this great house that our friends gave us for a week to stay in San Diego, as we packed up in the midst of trying to get to the airport and the busyness and the craziness, you know what we did? We got all the stuff in the car and we went back in the house and we just stood in a circle and we prayed. Now, when you got a 7-year-old sitting there, you know, she just wants to go, and a 10-year-old distracted by this, and a 12-year-old, you know, you're sitting there and you're like, hey, we got to go. We got to hit the airport. We stopped and we prayed for 5 minutes to do what? To thank God after our trip for what happened during our trip, to thank him for the blessings of his life. They see that. Even though they don't want to necessarily do it in the moment, they are going to do what you do, right? They're going to do what you do, not what you say. I was sitting at lunch with my family yesterday, and one of the kids looked at the other one and goes, and she goes, hey, don't touch my napkin. She's like, I'll napkin your face. And I'm like, whoa, we do not talk like that. And all of them in unison looked at me and they went, we got that from you. I'm like, what? I've never talked like that in my life. What are you talking about? And no joke, my 12-year-old pulls her little iPod out, goes, yes, you did. Boom, and it's audio recording of me at a weak moment saying to one of them, yeah, I'll do that to your face as a joke. And now they go, well, if daddy can say it, I can say it. These kids are recording you, by the way, now. It's nuts. I was in the car the other day and my one daughter said, hey, do that Valley Girl thing that you do. And so I do this voice whenever they go to sleep, and I do this big spiel about, hey, it's the 80s and someone called me up and I don't know, I want to go to the mall. And so I don't want to go to the mall. You want to go to the mall? So I pick up the phone and like, who's calling me? Oh, it's Brittany. Hi, Brittany. So I do this thing. So I do it for them every time they go to sleep. And anyway, she goes, do that thing that you do. So I do this 5-minute spiel. I'm going to the movies with Brittany and Kristen, you know. Anyways, and unbeknownst to me, her friend is recording the whole thing on her phone and goes home and shows it to her father and goes, this is how Pastor Mark talks. Boom, all right? Father's like, you're not even allowed over there anymore, all right? These kids are doing these days. Anyways, they're gonna actually do what they see you do. Your kids are gonna spend money on what you spend money on in life, man. On what you do, not what you tell them to do, on how you lived your life. One of the realities was we were supposed to come home Friday, and my best bud's father had a stroke a few days before we left, and we had the plane set and everything, we were ready to go, and Friday came along, and Aaron and I started to sense that we needed to go see him. And so we called the airline, said, hey, we want to change our flight. They said, you can't, it's too late. Your flight leaves in 3 hours. You should have thought of this. And I'm like, okay. And so we had to buy all new airline tickets to leave the next day. And we got change rental cars at the airport and drove 3.5 hours from San Diego into Palm Springs so that we could go visit who has basically become a grandfather to my kids. They call him Papa. And he had a stroke and he's in this hospital. And so we went in yesterday and, you know, Sienna got her ukulele out and played him, you know, a concert sitting there, and he's, you know, can barely talk in the left side of his, and just had this like hour with him to pray and to hug him and whatever. And our kids understood that we spent that money and spent that time doing that because this was family. And we wanted to go and shepherd and love on someone that has loved on us in his life. And that's a priority for us. Yes, we will not come home that day, and we will go and spend the next 5 hours trying to figure out a plane thing and get rental cars and drive because we want to show someone love, because we are here to actually sacrifice our own pleasures and delights for the sake of the glory of God. That's what life is, and my kids see that. Now, I could tell them that all day, right? I could say this, but it was when they saw it. That's what's going to shape their life, and it's the same with your kids. Number 3, make spiritual space in your home. If all you do with all you and your buddies is talk about secular stuff, then that's all that's going to matter to your kids. Your kids will never have a spiritual filter. If all you talk about is just whatever, hey, my house this, the lawn that, the car that. I listened to my wife over the last couple weeks as we've had sleepovers at my house. There was a bag of money that was sitting there that we'd collected for a thing that we needed to drop off. And some of it went missing. And there were a bunch of girls in our house. And so, if it was me, because I'm a really good, parent, I would have sat them all down and just said, no one is leaving, eating, or going to sleep until someone confesses. All right, that's how I would have rolled, right? And they would have sat there like a survivor game, for 4 hours, and then someone just cracks and confesses just because they want to go to sleep. But my wife didn't do that. She talked about, if the money ends up there, you never even have to confess, just put it back, and talked about generosity and Jesus and what we're gonna, and then a couple days later, had another sleepover, and all these girls were over, and they wanted to start talking about sex, and so my wife I hear her up there giving them like the sex talk and I'm like, man, these are spiritual moments that she's able to have with these girls that are, you need to create space for spiritual conversations in your life, not just secularized nonsense where all you do is talk about the weather and the stuff of the world constantly, or else your kids are never gonna understand what is actually meaningful to you, right? You have to shape them. That's the point of your life. You're gonna influence, they say the biggest influence in your kids' lives, the top 3. The first one is parents. The second one is what? Peers, right? So the way that you're gonna actually influence your kids is helping select their peers. And the third one's grandparents, right? And I saw that, even yesterday as Papa sat and sang them, and held my daughter's hand and said, you're beautiful, and this is what Jesus is gonna do in your life, and he's sitting there in pain himself, and my daughter's crying as he's blessing her. I mean, it's just this beautiful reality of a family together doing those things. Okay, fourthly, train your kids with this thought continually before your eyes, that the soul of your child is the first thing to be considered. The soul of your child. Meaning more important than having good manners and reading and arithmetic and being polite and getting on the cheerleading squad and having 14 extracurricular things or being successful in life is the state of your kid's soul. That's the most important thing. So what are your kids, how do they actually function? Have you asked those deeper questions, or are you just worried about, I gotta make sure they're in the best schools and that they have a good, whatever. James K. Smith, who's a philosopher, he said this: what is education for? It's not primarily about the absorption of ideas and information, but the transformation of people. And education is a constellation of practices, rituals, and routines that inculcates a particular vision by means of material embodied practices. If education is primarily formation, then that means education is happening all over the place. Education as formation isn't the sort of thing that stays neatly within the walls of a school or college or university. It's about formation, and it needs to be attentive to all the formative work that is happening in your kid's life at every moment. That's what Deuteronomy's talking about. You need to have spiritual conversations and actually look at the state of your kid's soul versus the state of just their life and whatever. The fifth one is very connected to that. And it's you need to prioritize the community called the church actually in your kid's life. And what I mean by that, I heard a preacher a few years ago say this, and it always stuck with me, that you can sit here and come and complain to me at the front that your young adult kid has gone off the rails and they don't love Jesus anymore and they don't come to church anymore. But my question to you is gonna be, what have you done for the last 5 or 6 years? Because here's what I see over and over, he said. He said, I see parents who simply drop into church and leave because they gotta get the baseball practice, they gotta get the soccer practice. And he said, in that moment, here's what you've shown your kid: that kicking around a stupid soccer ball is more important than the God of the universe. That's on you. That's collateral damage for your sin, not mine. And so your kid has no idea what community is, has no idea what accountability is, has no idea what leadership is, and you're gonna blame the church for that? It's your job to raise your kid in the ways of Jesus and form them. Our job is to do our best to love them, build community with them, partner with you, and that's what we're committed to. But we can't do that if your priority is not the community called the church. You come in late, you leave early, your kid sees that. And what they say is, this life is not a priority. This life over here is all the stuff we actually spend money and time and energy on. This church thing, man, we're checking a box off. Community doesn't matter. And so you need to make sure the community becomes an essential part of your life over and over and over again. And in fact, that your job is to, and you and your kids' job is to serve the people called the church, not to just have the church serve you, right? Over and over again, as I develop leaders. I was talking to Chris Brown about this, a pastor down in San Diego. He said, one of the problems is I'll be hiring someone as a pastor and they'll get through all these stages, and all of a sudden they'll say to me, when do I get on the stage and preach on a weekend? And he looks at me and says, see, you've lost it. And Judge Wilhite, the other guy I was talking to, has a church of 20,000 people in Vegas. We were speaking at this conference together. He said what he does is he brings all these young guys out on the stage, and he says, you see all these seats? Just picture it. Everyone's hanging on every word. Everyone's laughing at every joke. People are excited. People love your teaching. People are sending you emails. Picture it now. Picture it. Do you see it? There's just 40 guys up there foaming. Yeah. And he's like, none of you are ever going to get it. Here's what your job is. You learn to serve those people first, and maybe they will give you the right to teach them. Your job's to wash their feet. If your family understands your posture is not to take from the church, but to be the church and to serve one another in the church, that will change their life. Because all of a sudden there'll be Philippians 2 type people who say, I look at the other people as more important than myself. And then lastly, put Jesus first in your life. Over and over and over again, put Jesus first in your life. Because they see that. Now, here's the other thing. The last thing I'll say from this text. I'll pray for you. I did baptize also the household of Stephanas. That's the dream. Beyond that, I did not know whether I baptized anyone else. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, and not with words of eloquent wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. You know, it's fascinating. What he's about to shift into is there's two kinds of roads you can take in your life. You can take the way of human wisdom and philosophy and what looks really smart to people, or he says, you can take the way that looks really dumb to everybody, which is the way he's going to explain the way of the cross. He says in verse 18, for the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing. In verse 21, for since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. Verse 27, but God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. Here's the reality. Your moments of weakness is when God is going to show up and do something amazing. Your moments of brokenness is when God is going to show up and do something amazing in your life. And you should want him to show up, because here's the thing, he is better. Then the reason we sin is because we don't really believe that God is better than the things of the world. I want to take the worldly philosophy. I want to take the ideas of the world, I want to attach myself to those versus the idea of the cross, which doesn't look like power at all. It looks like failure. It looks odd. It looks upside down. And that's Paul's whole point, is the wisdom of the world would tell you that something like the cross, God dying, is actually a fail. But the beauty of it is here's how powerful God is. This is how good he is that he did the cross to save you. And so we're supposed to go, my goodness, it's upside down, it's backwards. But I want to see, here's how powerful he is. Remember a couple weeks ago when I shared that story about sweet baby Jesus? Right, and I talked about the idea that God would take a golf game and take the terrible golfer, and that ball got lost many times, and it was just people think, so sweet baby Jesus story. And I was talking about the idea of this guy, Ethan, and we met him in Phoenix, and we played golf with him. A girl walked up to me last week, and she said, hey, I was hanging out in this place, and this guy had flown in from New York, and we were all chilling at this pub or whatever, and he said he was here on business. And he looked at me and he said, we started talking about Jesus, and I started talking to him about my faith. And I said to him, hey, do you believe in Jesus? He's like, no, I don't believe in any of that. I don't believe in anything. And she's like, well, you should, hey, you should listen to some sermons of my pastor. And he's like, yeah, whatever. If you send me one, fine. He goes back to New York. She sends him, she just randomly goes on the website and selects a random sermon. Sends it to him. Doesn't hear anything back. 2 days later, gets a text from her. And he goes, oh my goodness, this is crazy. He's like, 3 months ago, I flew to Phoenix. And I was playing golf at a golf course. I just listened to this sermon that your pastor preached about going to Phoenix and playing golf with this guy, Ethan, and the Sweet Baby Jesus ball. He goes, I stopped the sermon right there. 3 months ago, I flew to Phoenix for one day because I was with some friends, and we played golf at this golf course, and they put us together with a guy named Ethan Castle, and we played golf with him. 3 months later, you send me a random sermon, and your pastor's preaching a sermon about playing golf with Ethan Castle. What in the world is going on right now? He's hunting you down. That's what's going on, fool. Right? That's how powerful he is. It's crazy. Anyway, listen. Let me end this way. Here you have an image of the cross. Here you have an image of our moments of weakness is when God looks really strong. I grew up in Ontario. You guys have heard of Avril Lavigne before? Most of you. So Avril Lavigne grew up in a place called Napanee, which is near where I grew up. And my best friend ended up being her drummer. So before anybody knew who she was, my best friend Matt called me up one day. He's like, hey, there's this girl, Avril. She's got this album coming out, and I'm going to be her drummer. And so we went out. I remember going to the lake, and he showed me the album, and I listened to it. I'm like, yeah, it's not going to go anywhere. Anyway. And so anyway, she went to stardom and became Avril Lavigne for all those years and lived an amazing life, rock star life. She married one of my other really good friends, Derek, for a while. They got divorced and she married again. And anyway, lived this kind of, now she grew up in the church. She learned how to sing growing up in the church. Her family are Christians. And she had this faith, but then she went to stardom and had life and lived this crazy existence. And my buddy was there and got to meet her. And anyway, about 4 or 5 years ago, she got Lyme disease and she got sick and she almost died. She was on the brink of death. And out of that, she wrote a song. And it's just been released and it's #1 kind of everywhere. But it's a song that drew her back to God. What did it? Fame? Nope. Distracted her. Pain, weakness, drew her to the brink where she thought she was going to die. She almost died. And in the midst of that, she wrote a song going, you're all I got. And so I've asked Shiloh to do it for you.
I'm too young to fall asleep. God, keep my head above water, keep me drowned. It gets harder, I'll meet you there at the altar as I fall down to my knees. Don't let me drown. 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 Don't let me drown.
The cries that we all have in moments of pain and weakness is where God gets our attention at times. And that's where Paul's about to shift into for the next section. The power of the cross, as ridiculous as it looks, is the thing we all get to reach out to in our moments of humility and weakness, and then God's gonna take you and do something crazy. I don't know, I've just been moved hearing the lyrics of that song and understanding a bit of her story. I actually talked to Matt and gonna reach out to her as a pastor and just see if she needs direction, discipleship. But this is a story of all of our lives in some way, shape, or form. And so the question is, do you try to do it on your own? Or do you reach out to the power of the cross, as foolish as it seems? Father, our prayer is that you would change not only what we do, but what we want to do. Because the power of the cross, as foolish as it looks, you take the weakness, and that's where you are very strong. That's where lives can pivot and change on the spot. In this room, in the rooms that are watching this, people are at the end of themselves in many ways, emotionally, physically, spiritually. And I pray they'd have the courage to actually cry out, don't let this end me. This is like Jonah and the whale, the same poem he basically gives, don't let me die, don't let me drown, keep my head above water. And I pray that the power of the cross is what each and every person who can hear my voice right now would actually hold on to, versus themselves and the nonsense this world has to offer them, which looks really smart, but which in the end is folly. I pray that you do that among us. In Jesus' good name we pray. Amen.